For 265 years, from 1603 to 1868, Japan's samurai had almost no war to fight. You would expect a warrior class with nothing to do to go soft, to rust, to fade into harmless old men telling stories about their grandfathers. Instead, something stranger happened. The longest peace in Japanese history did not tame the samurai. It transformed them into something more dangerous than any battlefield had ever produced. It manufactured an imagined warrior past so seductive that, centuries later, a modern state would dig it up and use it to help march an entire nation into the deadliest war it would ever know. This is the story of how peace, not war, made the samurai deadly. It begins with one battle, and then no battles at all. In the autumn of the year 1600, on a foggy field called Sekigahara, around 160,000 warriors clashed to decide who would rule Japan. When the fog lifted, a lord named Tokugawa Ieyasu stood victorious. 3 years later, the emperor named him Shogun, the supreme military ruler. Ieyasu moved the seat of power to a town called Edo, the city we now call Tokyo. And then he did something remarkable. He locked the country down. What followed is called the Pax Tokugawa, the Tokugawa Peace. And it was real. For roughly 2.5 centuries, there was no major internal war. There was one significant exception, an uprising in the region of Shimabara in the late 1630s. After that was crushed, Japan saw no major armed conflict for 230 years. 230 years. Generations of men were born, trained as warriors, grew old and died, without ever seeing a battlefield. Now, picture the problem this created. At the top of Japanese society sat the samurai, roughly 7 or 8% of the population, a hereditary warrior elite. By law, they were the fighters. They alone carried the 2 swords. They alone ranked above the farmers, the artisans, the merchants. Their entire identity, their reason for existing, was war, and war had simply stopped. So what does a warrior caste actually do, day to day, when there is no one to fight? The answer is almost comic in its ordinariness. They became bureaucrats, tax clerks, castle town administrators. The higher-ranking men ran domains, collected taxes, and administered justice. The lower-ranking ones did clerical work, guard duty, and policing. Historians have a wonderful phrase for them. They call them fighting bureaucrats, men who spent their days pushing rice ledgers across a desk. And yet, the martial arts did not die with the wars. They exploded. Freed from the battlefield, the fighting schools, the ryu, multiplied into the hundreds, each with its own lineage, its licenses, its guarded secrets. But something shifted in the shift. The old combat crafts, the Bututsu, were quietly refined into ways, the Budo. Swordsmanship stopped being a method for killing a man on a field and became Kenjutsu practiced as discipline, a lifelong drill in a technique the practitioner would almost certainly never use in earnest. The sword had become a subject of study, pursued with the seriousness once reserved for using it, and they were paid in rice. A samurai's salary was a fixed stipend measured in koku, 1 koku being roughly the amount of rice needed to feed a person for a year. But here's the trap. Their pay was frozen in rice, while the real economy quietly shifted to cash and coin. Prices rose. Their fixed grain income did not. Slowly, the proudest men in Japan slid into debt, and the people they borrowed from were the merchants, the lowest class in the official order, the class the samurai were supposed to look down upon. A Cambridge study on this era is bluntly titled The Increasing Poverty of the Samurai. Many of them ended up pawning their own swords and armor just to pay the grocer, so the warrior looked elsewhere for something to master. There were no elaborate rules of etiquette for how to wear and handle a blade one rarely drew. And beyond the sword, the samurai turned scholar and aesthete. Neo-Confucian texts, the tea ceremony, poetry, the slow theater of no. A caste built for killing spent 2 centuries perfecting the pastimes of a man with nowhere to be. Here is the identity crisis in a single image. You are legally a warrior. You carry two blades everywhere you go. You will almost certainly never draw them in anger. So what does a warrior do when there is nothing left to fight? He performs. He turns his life into a stage, and the first thing he dresses up is his armor. Consider the kabuto, the samurai helmet. In wartime, a helmet has one job: stop things from hitting your head. But in the Tokugawa peace, with no things flying at anyone's head, the helmet's job changed completely. It became art. It became costume. It became a billboard for status. And so the helmets got wild. Armorers built fantastic shapes on top of a plain iron skullcap, using a clever technique of lacquered papier-mâché over a wooden frame, light enough to actually wear, and they went gloriously insane. There were helmets shaped like rabbit ears, tall and fluffy, perched on the head of a grim-faced warrior. There were helmets shaped like a catfish tail, sweeping upward, dusted with silver on one side and gold on the other, shimmering. Catfish, by the way, were the creatures Japanese folklore blamed for earthquakes. There were helmets crowned with giant deer antlers, worn by a general who claimed a deer once guided him safely across a flooded river. There were helmets shaped like water buffalo horns, like a bear's head, like an acorn, trimmed with black fur, like a 2-foot-tall silver hat, because the taller the hat, the bigger the man was said to be. The most famous of all belonged to a lord named Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon. His helmet was crowned by an enormous golden crescent moon, sweeping off to one side, and the detail is perfect. The crescent was mounted to snap off, so that if an enemy ever grabbed it, it would break away rather than snap his neck. An enemy who, in Masamune's later years, never came. That crescent moon, incidentally, is often cited as an inspiration for Darth Vader's helmet. Some men even wore their beliefs on their heads. One commander wore a helmet bearing the giant single character for love. There were menpo, iron face masks, sculpted into fierce, snarling grimaces, some fitted with horsehair mustaches and detachable noses, armor that performed an expression. And here is the paradox at the heart of it all. This was the golden age of terrifying, magnificent war gear, and it was the most peaceful era in Japanese history. The wilder the helmet, the safer the times. Because where did a samurai actually wear this stuff? Not into battle, into parades. And there was a runway to walk it on. The shogun required every lord to march to Edo and back on a fixed rotation, a system called Senken Kotai, and the march became a competition. Since display now measured status, each procession swelled with more banners, more armor, more borrowed men, all of it staged to outglitter the lord ahead. Historians reckon this theater could swallow something like a quarter of a domain's yearly income. The armor that never saw a battlefield and the parades that showed it off helped bury the samurai in exactly the debt we keep circling back to. Under a system that forced every lord to march a grand procession to Edo and back, the road became a runway. The battlefield had been replaced by a fashion show. Consider the dragonfly. Real samurai prized it as the kachimushi, the victory insect. Admired for a single trait, it flies only forward straight at its prey and never retreats. So they perched it on the front of the helmet, a promise of nerve rendered in metal. And to build these shapes, the armors reached for a technique called harikake, papier-mâché, soaked in lacquer. Layered over the iron bowl, it let them make almost anything. Helmets sprouted rabbit ears, seashells, the coiling arms of sea creatures. The lighter the material, the wilder the silhouette. A warrior could now go off to a piece he would never fight, and dressed as a mollusk. But a helmet can only prove so much. Deep down, a man who calls himself a warrior needs to prove he is still a warrior. And with no enemy left to face, the samurai found a new place to point the blade. Inward. The act was called seppuku, ritual self-sacrifice. On the battlefield, it had once been a rough, desperate thing, a way to avoid capture. But in the long peace, the bureaucrats did to death what they did to everything else. They formalized it. They wrote manuals, they turned it into ceremony, where every object and every gesture carried meaning. Let us handle this with the restraint it deserves. In symbols only. Picture a man in a plain white robe, the color of purity and of death. Picture him kneeling on a clean mat. Picture a short blade resting on a small wooden tray wrapped in white paper. And picture beside him a second man, the Kaishakunin, a trusted, skilled swordsman, whose solemn duty was to end things swiftly and spare all suffering. That is all we need to see. A white cloth, a bowed silhouette, nothing more. And here's the detail that reveals what peace had done. By the later years, the blade itself sometimes became purely symbolic. In certain ceremonies, the man did not reach for a knife at all. He reached for a folded paper fan, laid before him where a weapon once would have been. And the mere gesture of reaching for it was the signal. A ritual sacrifice had quietly become something else entirely, dressed in the costume of honor. So thoroughly had the peacetime state ritualized death that the government actually had to pass a law in the 1660s, forbidding retainers from killing themselves to follow a dead lord into the grave. They were doing it in such numbers that the system could not afford the loss. Read that again. The state had to legislate against its warriors dying too eagerly. Which brings us to the story that the entire era could not stop telling itself. The 47 Ronin, masterless samurai. It began in 1701. A young lord named Asano drew a blade inside the shogun's own castle and wounded an official who had, by tradition, insulted and provoked him. Though the truth is, historians admit, we do not really know why Asano snapped. Drawing a weapon in that place was an unforgivable breach. Asano was ordered to perform seppuku that same day. His lands were seized, and his loyal retainers, in an instant, became ronin, masterless, purposeless, armed men. The official who provoked him was punished with nothing. That imbalance lit a slow fuse. For nearly 2 years, the chief retainer, a man named Oishi, played the part of a broken drunk to convince the official's spies that no revenge was coming. Then, on a snowy winter night, 47 of them crossed the city, stormed the official's mansion, and avenged their lord. They carried a single offering to Asano's grave and turned themselves in. And now, the government faced an impossible question. The very question the whole era was living inside. Were these men heroes or criminals? They had fulfilled the warrior code perfectly. Absolute loyalty unto death. But they had also broken the law completely. An unauthorized private vendetta, an armed assault, a defiance of the shogun's authority. To execute them as murderers would insult a loyalty the entire country admired. To pardon them would gut the rule of law. Japan's finest scholars argued about it for years. The compromise they reached says everything. The 46 who remained were allowed to die by their own hand, honorably, rather than be executed as common criminals. And almost immediately the nation turned the whole affair into its favorite play, told and retold for centuries. A desk-bound society, thrilling to a story about warriors who actually acted like warriors, mourning an ideal it had made obsolete. And that ideal has a name: Bushido, the way of the warrior. You have heard it described as the ancient, unbroken, sacred code of the samurai, passed down for 1,000 years. Here is the shocking core of this whole story. That is very largely a myth. The historian Oleg Benesh, in a landmark study, calls Bushido an invented tradition. When you actually examine the historical record, there was never a single agreed upon samurai-wide ethical code in pre-modern Japan. There were writings, yes. The most famous is the Hagakure from around 1716, but look closely at it. It was dictated by a man born after the era of real samurai warfare, a man with no combat experience who became a Buddhist priest. And his book is essentially one long complaint that the samurai of his own day had gone soft, grown greedy, forgotten who they were. The so-called Warrior Bible was a nostalgic lament, written in peacetime, by a man who had never fought, and it was then largely forgotten for 200 years. The version of Bushido the world actually knows was crystallized shockingly late. Its single most influential source is a book from the year 1900, written by a Japanese Christian named Inazo Nitobe, titled Bushido, The Soul of Japan. And here is the twist. He wrote it in English, for a Western audience. He deliberately compared the samurai to European medieval knights, leaning on Western and Christian ideas to convince Europeans and Americans that the Japanese were a noble people they could respect. It became a bestseller. Theodore Roosevelt read it, and so the West's romantic picture of the samurai was, in a sense, invented for the West, then imported back into Japan as if it had always been there. Consider what makes this so strange. Before the 1890s, you can count the books that even use the word Bushido on one hand. Nitobe was romanticizing a warrior class that, by 1900, had been abolished for about 30 years, because the modern Japanese government of the late 1800s had systematically dismantled the samurai. It banned their swords in 1876. It ended their rice stipends. It stripped away every legal marker of what a samurai was. The state deleted the samurai as a class, and then, once they were safely gone, it resurrected them as a spirit, a national soul. And a government that was about to go build an empire found that invented spirit extraordinarily useful. Now, we must tread carefully, because this is where the story turns dark, and the easy version of it is wrong. It is tempting to say the ancient samurai code led Japan into the Second World War. That is not what happened, and it matters that we get it right. The samurai class had been abolished for 4 decades. The ideology that drove Japan's war was not their actual code. It was a modern invention, assembled by a modernizing state that borrowed the samurai's imagery and vocabulary and aimed them at a new target. The real engine was not Bushido at all. It was the cult of the emperor, as a living god, institutionalized as state Shinto, demanding absolute devotion. Bushido was one thread woven into that much larger fabric. What it supplied was the emotional mechanism, a way to take loyalty once owed to a feudal lord and redirect it to the emperor, and to make dying for him feel like an ancient duty rather than a modern demand. You can see the machinery at work. In 1941, the army issued a field code forbidding soldiers to surrender, to be taken alive. This was not a 1,000-year-old rule. It was a fresh order, printed under a war minister's name, dressing a modern command in old warrior language. And here's the detail that exposes the whole illusion. Real samurai surrendered constantly. In medieval Japan, switching sides was common and carried little lasting shame. There was even a recognized law of surrender. The absolute no-surrender ethos was newer than the telegraph. The same is true of the mass death slogans of the war's final years. The idea of a whole population shattering like a jewel, rather than yielding. That very phrase was borrowed from a Chinese text over 1,000 years old. The wartime creed was a collage, a modern pastiche stitched together from scraps and presented as bloodline. As for the young pilots sent on one-way missions, let us be careful there too. They were not a wall of eager fanatics. That is a wartime cartoon that outlived the war. Nor were they simply victims. Their letters reveal young men caught between belief, crushing pressure, and private dread, in a system engineered to make refusal feel like shaming your own family. The deaths belong to the state that manufactured that pressure, not to any flaw in a people, and that is the true shape of the deadliness. The most lethal expression of the warrior ideal came not from warriors. It came from the descendants of an office worker caste, from a nostalgia for a war they had never fought, mass-produced by a modern government that needed a heroic past and simply built one. Which leaves us, at the end, back where we started, with the helmets. They sit in museums now, behind glass, absurd and genuinely beautiful. The giant crescent moon, the shimmering catfish tail, the deer antlers, the fluffy rabbit ears, made with astonishing skill by men who would almost certainly never fight, for a world that had remarkably stopped fighting. And perhaps that is the quiet, real legacy of the Edo samurai. Not the invented code. Not the war their imagery was eventually drafted into, but the peace itself. 2.5 centuries of it, one of the longest stretches of calm any major society has ever known. The rabbit ears were made in that calm, and the strangest part is what came after. The grandchildren of the men who made those helmets would be told that the objects meant something they never did, that they represented an ancient, unbroken, deadly code, when in truth, they were the playful costumes of a warrior caste that had run out of war. So, I will leave you with the question. The whole thing keeps circling. If a code was mostly invented later, dreamed up in peacetime and written in English for foreigners, does that make it any less real once millions of people believe it and act on it and die for it? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you would like to keep following these strange threads through history, consider subscribing. There is always another familiar story hiding something far stranger underneath.